Good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Droning Professor. Tonight we're going to learn about Galen, the ancient surgeon whose techniques still work today. So, as you make yourselves comfortable, please take a moment to let us know where you're listening from and feel free to subscribe. Now, as always, take a moment for some deep breaths, letting your mind and body relax for a good night of sleep. Tonight, I want to tell you about a man who was spectacularly wrong about the human body, whose mistakes killed people for over 1,000 years, and who is nonetheless one of the most important figures in the history of medicine. His name was Galen of Pergamon, and if you've ever been to a doctor, taken medicine, or appreciated the fact that surgeons wash their hands, you owe him a debt whether you know it or not. And if you've ever died of bloodletting, well, you can blame him for that too. Let me start with a question. What do you do when you're the second most famous physician in ancient Rome, and the most famous one is a complete fraud? If you're Galen, you challenge him to a public medical duel. Yes, that was a thing. The year was 162, and Galen had just arrived in Rome from his hometown of Pergamon in what's now Turkey. He was 32 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and absolutely insufferable. The kind of person who would be unbearable on social media today. Actually, come to think of it, he basically invented the medical humblebrag. Oh, I cured another impossible case today. The patient's other 12 doctors had given up. Whatever. His opponent in this medical showdown was a physician who claimed he could diagnose any illness by taking the pulse. Just the pulse. Nothing else. Galen thought this was ridiculous, which, to be fair, it was. So he proposed a contest. They would both examine the same patients, and we'd see whose diagnosis was better. The other doctor, perhaps realizing he'd been challenged by the ancient equivalent of a chess grandmaster to a game of chess, declined. Galen spent the rest of his career reminding everyone that his rival had chickened out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand Galen, we need to go back to his childhood, because like many people who grow up to be extraordinarily accomplished and also extraordinarily annoying, he had a complicated relationship with his parents. Galen was born in 129 in Pergamon, a wealthy city that was basically the Silicon Valley of the ancient world. It had everything: a massive library second only to Alexandria, a famous medical school, a healing temple to the god Asclepius, and the kind of intellectual culture where people actually got excited about geometry. His father, Nikon, was an architect and mathematician, the kind of dad who probably helped with homework by making it 10 times more complicated than it needed to be. But he was also supportive and gave Galen the best education money could buy. His mother, whose name we don't know because ancient historians had fascinating priorities, was apparently a nightmare. Galen himself described her as short-tempered and describes watching her bite her serving maids and fight with his father constantly. He later wrote that watching his parents was his first education in philosophy, by which he meant he learned what not to do. Nothing says, "I'm in therapy," quite like writing about your mother's rage issues in your published medical texts. Nikon initially steered Galen toward philosophy. By age 14, Galen was studying with teachers from all the major philosophical schools: Stoics, Platonists, Peripatetics, and Epicureans. This was the ancient equivalent of getting degrees from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford simultaneously, except with more togas and fewer student loans. Galen absorbed everything. He learned logic, ethics, natural philosophy, and developed what would become his signature trait: the absolute conviction that he was right about everything because he'd thought about it really, really hard. Then, in 145, when Galen was 16, his father had a dream. In this dream, Asclepius, the god of medicine, appeared and told Nikon that his son should become a physician. Now, you might think, a dream? That's your career counseling? But in the ancient world, dreams from gods were taken very seriously. Also, Pergamon's entire economy was basically built around its Asclepius temple, which was like a combination of the Mayo Clinic and Disneyland. So Nikon pivoted, and Galen began studying medicine. This turned out to be an excellent decision, possibly the only career advice based on a dream that actually worked out. Galen threw himself into medical study with the same intensity he'd brought to philosophy. He learned anatomy, pharmacology, surgery, and most importantly, he learned to watch his patients carefully. He studied at Pergamon first, then traveled to Smyrna, Corinth, and finally to Alexandria, the crown jewel of medical education, where they actually let you look at human skeletons. In most places, human dissection was forbidden for religious and cultural reasons, but Alexandria was more relaxed about these things, probably because they'd been Greek-Egyptian cosmopolitan types for 500 years and had seen everything. Tragically, Galen's father died in 148 or 149, when Galen was about 19 or 20. This left Galen wealthy, independent, and free to pursue medicine without anyone telling him what to do. It's worth noting that Galen spent his entire adult life being grateful for his father, and somewhat less enthusiastic about his mother, which tells you something about ancient family dynamics and also about Galen's tendency to hold a grudge. After finishing his studies, Galen returned to Pergamon in 157 at age 28, and landed what might be the most metal job in ancient medicine, physician to the gladiators. Now, being a gladiator doctor was not a cushy position. These men were getting stabbed, slashed, crushed, and generally destroyed in creative ways for public entertainment. They were also extremely valuable property. A good gladiator represented a massive investment for his owner, like a racehorse or a Ferrari. So the pressure was on Galen to keep them alive and fighting. This is where Galen's genius started to show. He treated gladiator wounds as windows into the human body, calling them windows into the interior. Every sword slice, every spear wound, every crushed limb was an opportunity to see what was inside and understand how it worked. He experimented with different treatments, kept meticulous records, and developed surgical techniques that were genuinely innovative. He cleaned wounds thoroughly, which seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. He used wine as an antiseptic, which actually works because alcohol kills bacteria, though Galen didn't know about bacteria. He carefully observed which injuries were fatal and which weren't, learning anatomy through sheer brutal repetition. His success rate was apparently remarkable. He later boasted that during his tenure, only 5 gladiators died, compared to 60 under his predecessor. Now, we should take Galen's self-reported statistics with a grain of salt, the size of the Colosseum, because humility was not his strong suit. But even if we cut his numbers in half, that's still impressive. Word spread. Galen was becoming famous. In 162, at age 32, Galen decided Pergamon was too small for his talents and moved to Rome. This was the big leagues. Rome was the capital of the known world, home to perhaps 1 million people, and absolutely filthy with opportunities for an ambitious doctor. It was also dangerous. Rome had no medical licensing, no standards, and no way to distinguish a skilled physician from a guy who'd watched someone set a bone once and decided to hang out a shingle. Medical malpractice was rampant. Patients died all the time from terrible treatments, and because there were no consequences, charlatans flourished. Galen arrived in Rome with no connections, no reputation in the city, and a personality that can best be described as aggressively self-confident. He needed to make a splash, so he did what any rational person would do. He started performing public anatomical demonstrations, where he would dissect animals and challenge other doctors to duplicate his results. This was the ancient equivalent of a YouTube diss track, except with more pigs and fewer camera angles. Picture this. Galen would get a pig, paralyze its hind legs by cutting specific nerves, then challenge other physicians to restore the movement. They couldn't, because they didn't understand neuroanatomy. Then Galen would do it. The pig would walk again, and he'd essentially take a bow while his competitors slunk away in humiliation. He did variations of this trick over and over. He'd cut the nerve that controlled a pig's voice, silencing it, then restore the voice by reconnecting the nerve. He'd demonstrate the function of the kidneys by tying off ureters and showing that urine backed up. He was part scientist, part showman, part gladiator himself, except his arena was the lecture hall and his weapon was knowledge. This made him extremely popular with some people and extremely unpopular with others. The general public loved him. Here was a doctor who could actually explain what he was doing and prove it worked. Philosophers loved him because he spoke their language and brought logical rigor to medicine. Some wealthy Romans began hiring him, but other doctors hated him with the fire of 1,000 suns. He was making them look bad, which, to be fair, they were. But nobody likes being shown up in public, especially when their livelihood depends on people not realizing they're incompetent. Galen's big break came when he successfully treated a prominent philosopher named Odemus, who had been sick for a long time with what sounds like malaria or a similar recurring fever. Other doctors had failed. Galen succeeded, probably through a combination of good observation, decent treatments, and sheer luck. But in medicine, as in life, success is what matters. Odemus was friends with essentially everyone who mattered in Rome, and suddenly Galen had access to the highest levels of Roman society. He became the physician to multiple consuls, senators, and wealthy aristocrats. He cured the wife of Boethius, one of the most important men in Rome. He treated successful people with mysterious ailments, often correctly diagnosing problems that other doctors had missed. And crucially, he survived, because being a doctor to the powerful in ancient Rome was risky. If your patient died, their family might blame you, and in Rome, blame could be expressed with a knife or poison. Then, in 166, the Antonine Plague hit. This was probably smallpox, though we can't be certain, and it was catastrophic. The disease had been brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east, and it spread through the empire like wildfire. People died by the thousands. Rome was hit hard, and Galen sensibly decided this was a great time to leave town. He later claimed he had urgent business back in Pergamon. Sure, Galen, sure. He stayed away for several years, which is convenient if you don't want to be in a plague-ridden city, but inconvenient if you're trying to maintain a medical practice in that city. When the plague started to subside, the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus summoned Galen to Aquileia, a city in northern Italy, where they were marshalling troops for a campaign against Germanic tribes. Galen went, because you don't ignore a summons from two emperors unless you enjoy being executed. Lucius Verus died shortly after, almost certainly from the plague, which must have been awkward for everyone involved. Marcus Aurelius survived and requested that Galen accompany him on campaign. Galen, who had zero interest in living in a military camp watching soldiers die of disease and battle wounds, declined as politely as possible. He said he'd been commanded by Asclepius in a dream to stay in Rome. This was basically the ancient equivalent of "sorry, I have a doctor's appointment that day," except the appointment was with a god, which is harder to fact-check. Marcus Aurelius, who was a philosophical emperor and probably the most reasonable boss you could have in ancient Rome, accepted this excuse. But he assigned Galen an important job, taking care of his son and heir, Commodus, who was about 5 years old. This was simultaneously a great honor and a terrible responsibility. If anything happened to Commodus, Galen's life expectancy would drop to approximately 0. Fortunately, Commodus survived childhood, though he grew up to become one of the worst emperors in Roman history, eventually declaring himself Hercules reincarnated and fighting as a gladiator in the Colosseum. So, Galen kept him physically healthy but couldn't do much about the megalomania. During these years in Rome, from the late 160s through the 170s and beyond, Galen wrote, and wrote, and wrote. He was perhaps the most prolific medical writer in history. He wrote about anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, hygiene, diet, exercise, therapeutics, diagnosis, prognosis, and philosophy. He wrote commentaries on Hippocrates. He wrote case studies. He wrote defenses of his own work. He wrote attacks on other physicians' work. He even wrote a bibliography of his own writings, just to make sure nobody forgot how much he'd written. Modern scholars estimate he wrote between 3 million and 4 million words, which is roughly equivalent to 50 full-length books. And this was all done by hand, with a pen, on papyrus or parchment, with no computers, no word processors, not even a typewriter. Just Galen, his massive brain, his even more massive ego, and an apparently infinite supply of writing materials. About half of his work survives, which is still more than any other ancient medical writer by a huge margin. What was he writing about? Everything. But let me give you a sense of his anatomical work, because this is where Galen really shined, and also where he made his most spectacular errors. Galen believed that to be a good physician, you had to understand anatomy. This was not a universal view at the time. Many doctors thought anatomy was irrelevant, that you could treat disease without knowing what was inside the body. Galen thought this was idiotic, and he was right. You can't fix a machine if you don't know how it works. But here's the problem. Human dissection was largely forbidden in Rome. Galen couldn't cut open people to see how they worked, so he dissected animals. Lots of animals. Pigs, goats, dogs, cattle, horses, even an elephant on one occasion. Most importantly, he dissected Barbary apes, a species of macaque monkey that was common in North Africa and physically similar to humans. He assumed that what was true for apes was true for humans. This assumption was both brilliant and catastrophically wrong. It was brilliant because apes and humans are similar in many ways, and Galen made genuine discoveries by carefully studying ape anatomy. It was catastrophic because apes and humans are different in important ways, and Galen's mistakes became medical dogma for over 1,000 years. Let me give you some examples. Galen described a network of blood vessels at the base of the brain called the rete mirabili, which means wonderful net. This structure exists in ungulates, in hoofed animals like sheep and cows. It helps regulate blood flow to their brains. Galen described it in humans, where it does not exist. He said blood passed through this network and was transformed into psychic pneuma, the substance that powered thought. None of this is true. Humans don't have a rete mirabile, but because Galen said we did, European anatomists spent over 1,000 years trying to find it, and some of them convinced themselves they had. He described the human liver as having 5 lobes, like a dog's liver. Human livers have 2 main lobes. He described the human uterus as bicornuate, having 2 horns, like a dog's uterus. Human uteruses are single-chambered. He described bones that don't exist, and muscles that work differently than he said they did. Time and again, he described animal anatomy and asserted it was human anatomy because he was extrapolating from what he could observe. But here's the thing. Despite these mistakes, Galen's anatomical work was revolutionary. He was systematic. He was detailed. He was logical. He described nerves and distinguished them from tendons, which earlier physicians had confused. He traced the course of major blood vessels. He described the heart's valves and understood they prevented backflow. He described muscles with precision. He understood that the brain, not the heart, was the organ of thought, contradicting centuries of belief. He demonstrated that arteries carried blood, not air, which many physicians believed. He showed that the kidneys produced urine, that the bladder stored it, and that specific nerves controlled specific functions. His work on the nervous system was particularly impressive. He demonstrated that cutting the spinal cord at different levels caused paralysis of different body parts. He showed that the recurrent laryngeal nerve controlled the voice. He understood that sensory and motor functions were separate. This was extraordinary experimental work, carefully done and accurately reported, even if his conclusions about the underlying theory were often wrong. Because Galen didn't just want to describe anatomy, he wanted to explain physiology. How did the body work? What made it alive? And here we need to talk about Galen's theory of the body, which dominated Western medicine until the 1600s and which was magnificently, elaborately, beautifully wrong. Galen's physiology was based on the ancient theory of the four humors, which went back to Hippocrates and earlier Greek thinkers. The theory stated that the body contained four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These corresponded to four qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. They also corresponded to four elements: air, water, fire, and earth. And they corresponded to four temperaments: sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, and melancholic. Health meant having these humors in balance. Disease meant they were out of balance. Treatment meant restoring balance. This theory had a beautiful symmetry to it. Everything corresponded to everything else in a perfect pattern of fours. It was elegant, logical, and completely unsupported by reality. But it made intuitive sense. People could see that bodies contained fluids. When you were sick, your balance seemed off. When you had a fever, you were hot. When you had a cold, you were, well, cold. The theory explained everything in terms people could understand. Galen took this theory and elaborated it into an incredibly complex system. He added pneuma, which was a kind of vital spirit that came in three types. There was natural pneuma, produced in the liver, which powered basic bodily functions. There was vital pneuma, produced in the heart, which powered life itself. And there was psychic pneuma, produced in the brain, which powered thought and sensation. These pneumas traveled through the body in the blood and nerves, directing everything. He described how food was transformed into blood in the liver, then sent to the heart, where it was mixed with pneuma from inhaled air, then sent to the body to nourish it. Some blood went to the brain, where it was further refined into psychic pneuma and distributed through the nerves. This system explained digestion, respiration, circulation, sensation, thought, and movement in one grand unified theory. It was wrong, almost entirely wrong. The liver doesn't produce blood from food in the way Galen thought. The heart doesn't mix blood with air spirits. Pneuma doesn't exist. The brain doesn't refine blood into thought substance. The nerves don't carry psychic pneuma. Almost every detail of Galen's physiological theory is incorrect. But here's what's fascinating. The system worked for diagnosis and treatment, at least sometimes. If you believed that disease was caused by imbalanced humors, you could observe symptoms, classify them according to humoral theory, and prescribe treatments designed to restore balance. Sometimes this worked, not because the theory was right, but because some of the treatments were effective for other reasons. For example, Galen prescribed diet and exercise for many conditions. This is actually good medicine. If someone was overweight and sick, Galen might say they had an excess of phlegm and needed to eat less and move more. He'd be wrong about the phlegm, but right about the treatment. If someone had a fever, he might prescribe cooling treatments like cold compresses. Wrong theory, reasonable treatment. Of course, sometimes humoral theory led to terrible treatments. The most notorious was bloodletting. If you believed disease was caused by an excess of one humor, removing that humor made sense. Blood was the most obvious humor to remove, since you could see it and access it easily. So physicians would cut patients' veins and drain their blood, sometimes in shocking quantities. This treatment was supposed to restore humoral balance. What it actually did was weaken patients, sometimes fatally. George Washington, who died in 1799, was bled of nearly half his blood supply in his final illness, which certainly didn't help him recover. Bloodletting persisted into the 1900s in some places, killing or harming countless people, all because of humoral theory. Galen himself was cautious about bloodletting compared to later physicians. He recommended it selectively, not universally. But he provided the theoretical justification, and later doctors ran with it, enthusiastically draining blood from anyone and everyone. This is one of the great tragedies of medical history, a well-meaning theory, elaborated by a brilliant man, becoming dogma that killed people for well over 1,000 years. But let's return to Galen's life. By the 170s, he was at the peak of his career. He was wealthy, famous, respected by emperors and philosophers. He had more patients than he could handle, and he had enemies, lots of enemies. Other physicians resented his success and his arrogance. Some tried to poison him, or so he claimed. He wrote about suspicious illnesses he suffered after eating with rivals, though whether these were actual poisoning attempts or Galen's paranoia is hard to say. In 176, a fire destroyed much of Rome, including part of the Temple of Peace where Galen had stored some of his books and medical supplies. He was devastated. He'd lost irreplaceable materials and unpublished writings. This fire also destroyed the temple of the Capitoline Hill, along with many important records, so Galen's loss was part of a larger catastrophe. But for a writer as prolific as Galen, losing work must have felt like losing a part of himself. He kept writing. He wrote about hygiene, arguing that cleanliness prevented disease. He was right about this, though again, for the wrong reasons. He thought bad air and imbalanced humors caused disease, but his recommendations to keep wounds clean, bathe regularly, and maintain good sanitation were sound. He wrote about diet, developing elaborate theories about which foods had which properties. Some of his dietary advice was sensible, some was nonsense. He recommended moderate exercise, sufficient sleep, and avoiding stress, which is basically what doctors tell you today, except now they have scientific reasons for it. He wrote case studies describing patients he'd treated and how he'd diagnosed them. These are fascinating documents because they show Galen's diagnostic process. He would take a detailed history, asking about symptoms, diet, exercise, sleep, and emotional state. He would examine the patient, checking their pulse, which he believed could reveal the state of the humors. He would consider the patient's age, sex, occupation, and environment. Then he'd make a diagnosis and prescribe treatment. Sometimes his diagnoses were remarkably accurate. He correctly identified many cases of fever, inflammation, respiratory problems, and digestive issues. He understood that different diseases had different patterns. He knew that the timing and character of symptoms mattered. He was doing early epidemiology, tracking patterns of disease in populations. This was careful, intelligent medicine, even if his underlying theory was wrong. Other times, he was hilariously off base. He diagnosed one patient as having an excess of black bile because the man was sad and melancholic. The treatment was to purge the black bile through vomiting and laxatives. The patient may or may not have improved. Galen claimed he did, but Galen claimed all his treatments worked. He diagnosed another patient as having a wandering uterus, a condition that many ancient physicians believed in, where the uterus supposedly moved around the body causing symptoms. This is not a thing. Uteruses do not wander. But Galen prescribed treatments to lure the uterus back to its proper place, because why not? If you believe in wandering uteruses, you need wandering uterus treatments. Galen continued practicing and writing into old age. We don't know exactly when he died. The latest date we can confirm for certain is about 200, when he was 70 or so. Some sources suggest he lived into his 80s, dying around 210 or even later. Either way, he had a long, productive career by ancient standards, especially considering the plague years he lived through. After his death, something remarkable happened. Galen became medicine. Not just a physician, not just an author, but the foundation of medical knowledge. His works were collected, copied, and distributed throughout the Roman Empire. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the late 400s, Galen's works were preserved by Byzantine scholars in the East and by Islamic scholars who translated them into Arabic. Islamic physicians like Rhazes and Avicenna studied Galen intensely, adding their own observations and corrections, but largely accepting his framework. Jewish physicians studied him. Christian monks in medieval Europe copied his manuscripts. By the Middle Ages, Galen was essentially medical law. To study medicine meant to study Galen. To question Galen was to question medicine itself. This had good and bad effects. The good: Galen's emphasis on careful observation, systematic study, and logical thinking shaped medical education for centuries. His insistence that physicians understand anatomy meant that medical students learned structure and function. His case studies provided models for clinical thinking. His pharmacology, based on herbs and compounds, preserved valuable knowledge about medicinal plants. The bad: Galen's errors became unchallengeable dogma. When medieval anatomists dissected human bodies and saw structures that contradicted Galen, they assumed they were looking at abnormalities or that they'd misunderstood. The idea that Galen might be wrong was almost unthinkable. He was Galen. He'd dissected hundreds of animals, written millions of words, treated emperors. How could he be wrong? This stifled medical progress for centuries. Physicians spent their energy interpreting Galen rather than observing nature. They tried to force their observations into Galenic frameworks rather than developing new theories. Medical education became about memorizing Galen's texts rather than learning through practice. Innovation slowed to a crawl. The Renaissance began to change this. In 1543, Andreas Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, a revolutionary anatomy text based on actual human dissections. Vesalius found that Galen was wrong about many anatomical details. There was no rete mirabile in humans. The liver didn't have 5 lobes. The uterus wasn't bicornuate. Vesalius corrected hundreds of Galenic errors, though he did so respectfully, noting that Galen had been limited by having to dissect animals rather than humans. This began the slow process of dismantling Galenic medicine. In 1628, William Harvey published his work on the circulation of blood, demonstrating that blood circulated in a closed system pumped by the heart. This contradicted Galen's theory that the liver produced blood which was consumed by the body. Harvey showed that the same blood went round and round, propelled by the heart's contractions. This was revolutionary and faced significant resistance because it meant Galen was fundamentally wrong about physiology. Over the 1600s and 1700s, more and more of Galen's theories were overturned. The discovery of capillaries confirmed Harvey's circulation theory. The understanding of respiration showed that lungs exchanged gases, not pneuma. The development of chemistry revealed that humoral theory was nonsense. By the 1800s, Galenic medicine was dead, replaced by modern scientific medicine based on observation, experiment, and empirical evidence. So why are we still talking about Galen? If he was so wrong, why does he matter? Because Galen did something more important than being right. He established the method by which we could eventually discover he was wrong. He insisted that medicine should be based on careful observation of nature. He demanded that physicians understand anatomy and physiology before treating patients. He demonstrated the power of experimental investigation and logical reasoning. He showed that medicine could be systematic and teachable. Yes, his theories were wrong, but his approach was right. He was wrong in the way that scientists are wrong, by building theories from observations, testing them, and recording the results. Later scientists could look at Galen's work and say, he observed this, concluded that, but we observed something different, so we need a new theory. That's how science progresses. Galen also preserved an enormous amount of knowledge from earlier physicians. His commentaries on Hippocrates saved works that might otherwise have been lost. His pharmacological writings preserved recipes and techniques. His case studies documented diseases and their treatments. He was a bridge between ancient Greek medicine and the medieval world, keeping medical knowledge alive through centuries of chaos and collapse. He also influenced medicine in ways that are still relevant. His emphasis on hygiene and public health was ahead of its time. His recognition that mental and physical health were connected anticipated modern psychosomatic medicine. His patient-centered approach, taking detailed histories and considering the whole person, is something we still value. His insistence on physician training and ethical conduct helped establish medicine as a profession rather than just a trade. And on a human level, Galen is fascinating because he's so recognizable. He's brilliant but arrogant, accomplished but insecure, a careful observer who sometimes sees what he expects rather than what's there, a dedicated healer who's also desperate for recognition. He's flawed in ways that feel modern. You can imagine him on Twitter, getting into arguments with other doctors, subtweeting rivals, posting about his successes while complaining about how underappreciated he is. He'd be insufferable and also kind of compelling. His writing style gives us insight into his personality. He's often defensive, spending pages refuting critics, real or imagined. He name drops constantly, reminding readers that he treated consuls and philosophers. He includes anecdotes designed to show how clever he is. At the same time, he's genuinely passionate about medicine. He writes with excitement about anatomical discoveries. He's thrilled when he solves a difficult case. He believes deeply that medicine can and should help people. One of my favorite Galen stories comes from his case studies. A woman came to him complaining of insomnia and anxiety. Other doctors had tried various treatments without success. Galen examined her and found nothing physically wrong. He took a careful history and noticed that she became agitated when a certain dancer's name was mentioned. A famous pantomime performer was in town, and this woman was apparently infatuated with him. She was lovesick but couldn't admit it, perhaps because she was married or because it was socially inappropriate. Her unexpressed feelings were causing physical symptoms. Galen didn't have a treatment for lovesickness, but he recognized that her problem was psychological, not physical. He advised her attendants to be supportive and to let the infatuation pass naturally. This might seem obvious, but in an era when doctors routinely prescribed purging and bloodletting for everything, recognizing a psychological problem was sophisticated medicine. Another story. A philosopher came to Galen with numbness in the fourth and fifth fingers of one hand. Other doctors were baffled. Galen examined him and determined that the problem wasn't in the hand but in the neck, where a nerve was being compressed. He treated the neck problem, and the hand numbness resolved. This is excellent clinical reasoning, tracing symptoms to their source rather than just treating the symptom. But Galen also made mistakes, and he didn't always admit them. He records cures that seem implausibly successful. He dismisses critics without fully engaging with their arguments. He's selective in his reporting, emphasizing successes and downplaying failures. This is very human. We all want to look good. But it means we should read Galen critically, recognizing that he's presenting himself in the best possible light. His relationship with truth is complicated. He believed deeply in the importance of truth and accused other physicians of lying. He prided himself on his observational accuracy. But he also had theoretical commitments that sometimes distorted his observations. He believed in humoral theory, so he interpreted what he saw through that lens. He believed in teleology, the idea that everything in nature has a purpose, so he saw purpose in every anatomical structure, even when that purpose was imaginary. This is a common trap for scientists and physicians. We see what we expect to see. We interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support our theories. Confirmation bias isn't a modern invention. It's a fundamental feature of human cognition. Galen fell into this trap repeatedly, and his authority meant that his biases became everybody's biases for over 1,000 years. Let me talk a bit about Galen's philosophy, because it shaped his medicine. Galen was eclectic, drawing from multiple philosophical traditions, but he was fundamentally a teleologist. He believed that nature was purposeful, that everything existed for a reason, designed by divine providence. This was influenced by Plato and Aristotle, who both argued that nature was ordered and rational. Galen looked at the human body and saw design everywhere. The eye was perfectly designed for seeing. The hand was perfectly designed for grasping. Every structure served its purpose. This led to some genuine insights. Galen's recognition that structure and function were related was important. Understanding what something does helps you understand what it is. The shape of the heart valves makes sense when you understand they prevent backflow. The structure of muscles makes sense when you understand they contract to produce movement. But teleology also led Galen astray. He would invent purposes for structures he didn't understand. He thought the septum of the heart had invisible pores, allowing blood to pass between the ventricles, because that's what his theory required, even though he couldn't see them. He thought the brain's ventricles produced psychic pneuma because that's what made sense in his system, even though he had no evidence. When observation and theory conflicted, theory often won. Galen also had strong views on the relationship between medicine and philosophy. He argued that the best physician was also a philosopher, meaning someone trained in logic, ethics, and natural philosophy. He thought medicine required not just practical skill, but theoretical understanding. You needed to know not just how to set a bone, but why bones broke and how they healed. You needed to understand not just what treatment worked, but why it worked. This was a minority view. Many physicians were craftsmen who learned by apprenticeship and didn't bother with theory. Galen thought this was inadequate. He also thought that philosophers who theorized about the body without practical experience were useless. You needed both theory and practice, reason and observation. This integration of philosophy and medicine was one of Galen's lasting contributions. His ethics were interesting too. He had a complicated relationship with money. On one hand, he was wealthy and served wealthy patients who paid him extremely well. On the other hand, he claimed to despise physicians who practiced for profit rather than from love of the art. He wrote that true physicians should treat the poor as carefully as the rich, should value knowledge over money, should be modest and honest. Then he'd turn around and brag about curing a consul while insulting his competitors. This contradiction runs through Galen's work. He wanted to be seen as above petty concerns, motivated only by truth and the desire to heal. But he was also intensely competitive, status-conscious, and desperate for recognition. He wanted to be remembered as the greatest physician who ever lived, and he succeeded, though not in the way he imagined. It's worth noting that for all his arrogance, Galen did seem to genuinely care about his patients. His case studies show a physician who listened carefully, who worried about outcomes, who tried different approaches when the first one failed. He wasn't just going through the motions. He was engaged with the problem of healing, even when his theories led him in wrong directions. Consider his work on therapeutics, the art of treatment. Galen developed an elaborate system for classifying drugs based on their properties. He believed every substance had qualities, hot or cold, wet or dry, and to varying degrees. A substance might be hot in the first degree, meaning slightly hot, or hot in the fourth degree, meaning extremely hot. Same with the other qualities. By combining substances with different properties, you could create medicines tailored to specific imbalances. This system was fantastically complicated. Galen wrote about hundreds of drugs, describing their properties and uses. Some of these drugs were genuinely effective. Opium for pain, willow bark for fever and inflammation, various herbs for digestive problems. Others were useless or harmful. But the system gave physicians a framework for thinking about treatment systematically rather than randomly. Galen also invented theriac, or rather popularized and elaborated an existing formula. Theriac was a universal antidote, supposedly effective against poisons, venoms, and disease. The recipe contained dozens of ingredients, sometimes over 60, including everything from snake flesh to opium to exotic spices. It was extremely expensive and had to be aged like wine. Emperors kept supplies of theriac. It was considered the ultimate medicine. Did it work? Probably not as advertised. Some ingredients might have had some effect on some conditions. The opium would definitely do something, though whether that something was therapeutic or just made you not care about being sick is debatable. But theriac was popular for over 1,500 years. It was still being manufactured in the 1800s in some places. This tells you something about the power of reputation and tradition in medicine. Galen's influence extended beyond medicine into broader culture. Galenic ideas shaped how people thought about the body, personality, and health. The four temperaments, derived from the four humors, became a way of categorizing personalities that persisted into modern times. Someone sanguine was cheerful and sociable, supposedly because they had lots of blood. Someone melancholic was sad and introspective, supposedly from excess black bile. Someone choleric was angry and ambitious, from yellow bile. Someone phlegmatic was calm and sluggish, from phlegm. This personality typology is nonsense from a scientific standpoint. Humors don't determine personality, but it was a useful cultural shorthand. Medieval and Renaissance literature is full of characters described in humoral terms. The concept influenced art, music, and philosophy. When people talked about having a temperament or being in a bad humor, they were using language that went back to Galen and earlier Greek medicine. Galen's emphasis on regimen, meaning lifestyle and habits, also had lasting influence. He believed that health depended on 6 non-naturals: air, food and drink, sleep and waking, motion and rest, excretion and retention, and the passions of the soul. These weren't called non-naturals because they were unnatural, but because they were external factors that affected the body's natural state. Proper management of the non-naturals maintained health. This meant paying attention to your environment, your diet, your exercise, your sleep, your digestion, and your emotional state. Galen wrote extensively about each of these, giving advice that ranged from sensible to bizarre. Breathe clean air. Good advice. Avoid excessive emotion. Reasonable. Eat foods that match your humoral type. Not so useful. But the overall framework of lifestyle medicine, the idea that daily habits profoundly affect health, was valid and remains valid today. Galen also wrote about medical ethics, though not in a systematic treatise. His views are scattered throughout his works. He believed physicians should be knowledgeable, experienced, and honest. They should avoid doing harm, put the patient's welfare first, and maintain dignity. They shouldn't practice beyond their competence or make promises they can't keep. They should respect patient confidentiality and not exploit vulnerable people. These are good principles, and they echo the Hippocratic Oath, which Galen knew and respected. But Galen being Galen, he also spent a lot of time explaining how he embodied these principles while his competitors violated them. He was the ethical physician. They were greedy charlatans. He told the truth. They lied. He succeeded through skill. They succeeded through luck or deception. You get the idea. One area where Galen made significant contributions was pulse diagnosis. He wrote several treatises on the pulse, describing dozens of different types and what they indicated. He believed the pulse revealed the state of the vital pneuma, and thus the condition of the heart and arteries. He distinguished between different pulse rhythms, strengths, speeds, and patterns. He taught students to develop sensitivity to subtle variations in the pulse. Some of this was useful. Pulse rate, rhythm, and strength do provide information about cardiovascular function, though not in the way Galen thought. A rapid, weak pulse can indicate shock. An irregular pulse can indicate heart disease. Pulse taking became a fundamental part of medical examination, and it remains so today, though we now understand it very differently than Galen did. But Galen's pulse diagnosis went far beyond what the pulse can actually tell you. He claimed he could diagnose any illness by taking the pulse, which is absurd. He claimed he could tell a patient's emotional state, their humoral balance, which organs were affected, and what treatment was needed, all from the pulse. This led to centuries of physicians pretending they could diagnose complex conditions by pulse alone, which was wishful thinking at best and malpractice at worst. Let me tell you about one more aspect of Galen's work, his psychology, or rather his theory of the soul. Galen believed the soul had 3 parts, an idea he borrowed from Plato. There was the rational soul, located in the brain, responsible for thought and reason. There was the spirited soul, located in the heart, responsible for emotions and courage. And there was the appetitive soul, located in the liver, responsible for desires and basic drives like hunger and lust. These three souls needed to be in balance, with reason controlling spirit and appetite. When reason was weak, you were controlled by passion and desire. When spirit dominated, you were recklessly brave or angry. When appetite dominated, you were gluttonous and lustful. Health required rational control, assisted by proper education and philosophy. This tripartite soul theory influenced Christian theology in interesting ways. Church fathers read Galen and found his ideas compatible with Christian views of the soul, reason, and virtue. Galenic psychology merged with Christian moral teaching, creating a synthesis that dominated medieval thought. The idea that reason should govern passion, that the body's appetites needed control, that physical health affected moral capacity, all of these had Galenic roots. Of course, neuroscience has completely overthrown this model. We now know that thought, emotion, and desire all arise from brain activity. The heart doesn't think or feel, it pumps blood. The liver doesn't generate desires, it metabolizes substances. But Galen couldn't know this. He observed that injuries to different body parts affected different functions and constructed a theory that made sense given his evidence and assumptions. This is a pattern with Galen. Sensible reasoning from incomplete information leading to wrong conclusions. He was logical, careful, and systematic. His mistakes weren't random. They were structured by his theories and his inability to observe what he couldn't observe. You can't blame someone for not inventing the microscope or discovering bacteria or understanding biochemistry. Galen worked with the tools and knowledge available to him. What you can criticize is the way later generations treated Galen as infallible. The medieval cult of authority, where ancient writers were assumed to be correct and questioning them was suspect, held back medical progress dramatically. Galen himself would probably have hated this. He constantly challenged his predecessors when he thought they were wrong. He argued with Hippocrates, Erasistratus, and other famous physicians when he disagreed with them. He believed truth came from observation and reason, not authority. But irony of ironies, Galen became the ultimate medical authority, the one figure whose word was law. His own skeptical, questioning approach was used to establish a dogma that discouraged skepticism and questioning. This is the tragedy of how good ideas can be corrupted by institutionalization. The overthrow of Galenic medicine in the Renaissance and early modern period was a slow, painful process. Vesalius challenged Galenic anatomy but still accepted much of his physiology. Harvey overturned Galenic circulation but retained other elements. Paracelsus, a bombastic Swiss physician, publicly burned Galen's works and rejected humoral theory, but replaced it with equally wrong theories about chemical principles. Progress came piecemeal as different aspects of Galen's system were tested and found wanting. The rise of experimental science was crucial. When you could design experiments to test whether blood circulated or whether air contained something necessary for life or whether germs caused disease, you could move beyond ancient authority. The invention of new instruments, microscopes and thermometers and stethoscopes revealed things Galen never imagined. The development of statistics allowed researchers to determine whether treatments actually worked. Science became systematic, collaborative, and self-correcting in ways ancient medicine never was. By the 1900s, Galenic medicine was thoroughly dead in scientific circles, though elements lingered in folk medicine and alternative practices. But Galen himself was being reassessed. Historians of medicine began to appreciate his contributions while acknowledging his errors. They recognized that he'd done the best he could with the resources available. They saw how his work had preserved knowledge, shaped institutions, and established principles that remained valuable even when specific theories were wrong. Modern medicine owes Galen several debts. The idea that physicians should be educated, not just apprenticed, comes partly from Galen. The integration of basic science with clinical practice, anatomy and physiology with diagnosis and treatment, reflects Galenic principles. The emphasis on careful observation, Detailed record-keeping and logical analysis owes something to Galen's example. Medical ethics, the idea that physicians have special obligations to patients and society, was articulated by Hippocrates but elaborated and promoted by Galen. Even some specific practices trace back to Galen. The concept of prognosis, predicting disease course to help patients prepare, was Galenic. The use of case studies for teaching, presenting patients' histories and discussing diagnosis and treatment, follows a Galenic model. The practice of consulting previous literature, seeing what earlier physicians found and thought, reflects Galen's approach of engaging with medical tradition while advancing it. Of course, modern medicine has moved far beyond Galen in every way. We understand disease at the molecular level. We have technologies Galen couldn't have dreamed of. We can cure conditions, he thought, incurable, and prevent diseases he thought inevitable. Average human lifespan has nearly doubled in the developed world since Galen's time, partly because we stopped following his advice about bloodletting, and partly because we developed antibiotics, vaccines, surgery, and countless other advances. But here's something to consider. Much of modern medicine would make sense to Galen in terms of approach, if not content. The idea that you observe patients carefully, classify their conditions, determine the cause, and apply specific treatments based on evidence would be familiar to him. He'd be shocked by the details, obviously. Bacteria, viruses, DNA, evolution, these would blow his mind. But the scientific method, the clinical approach, the commitment to helping patients through knowledge and skill rather than prayer or magic, these he'd recognize and approve of. Galen also reminds us that brilliant people can be wrong, completely, systematically, elaborately wrong, while being right about the method for discovering they're wrong. Science isn't about being right, it's about being less wrong over time. Every scientist's work will eventually be superseded. Einstein overturned Newton, and someday someone will overturn Einstein in some way. That's not a failure of those scientists. It's how science works. We build on what came before, correcting errors and expanding knowledge. Galen would have understood this. He corrected Hippocrates. He expected others to correct him, though he also expected that he wouldn't need much correction because he was so brilliant. That last part was the problem. Humility in science is important. You have to be confident enough to propose new ideas, but humble enough to accept when evidence contradicts you. Galen had plenty of confidence, less humility. There's a lesson here for modern physicians and scientists. Confidence is good. Self-promotion can be valuable. Standing up for your ideas matters. But so does listening to criticism, admitting errors, and recognizing the limits of your knowledge. Galen's legacy includes both his achievements and the cautionary tale of what happens when brilliance combines with arrogance and others stop questioning. Let me end with a thought about medical progress. When we look back at Galen and laugh at his mistakes, we should remember that future generations will look back at us the same way. Some of what we believe about medicine now is certainly wrong. Treatments we consider standard today will be seen as barbaric or ineffective in the future. Our understanding of biology, while vastly superior to Galen's, is still incomplete and sometimes incorrect. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. Medical knowledge evolves. 100 years from now, physicians will have technologies and treatments we can't imagine. They'll wonder how we managed with such primitive tools. They'll be amazed that we didn't understand things that will seem obvious to them. And they'll make their own mistakes, which the next generation will correct. That's the nature of science and medicine. We do the best we can with what we know, while constantly seeking better knowledge. Galen did that. He observed, reasoned, experimented, and shared what he learned. He got a lot wrong, but he moved medicine forward. That's all any scientist can do. So here's to Galen of Pergamon, physician, anatomist, physiologist, philosopher, writer, and the man who was wrong about almost everything but changed medicine forever. He gave us systematic anatomy, experimental physiology, clinical observation, and the integration of theory and practice. He also gave us bloodletting, humoral theory, and over 1,000 years of wrong ideas. He was brilliant, arrogant, innovative, and deeply flawed. In other words, he was human, just like the rest of us. His story reminds us that progress is possible but not inevitable. Knowledge advances through hard work, careful observation, and the courage to challenge authority. But it can also stagnate when authority becomes dogma and questioning becomes heresy. We honor Galen best, not by revering him, but by following his example of curiosity and skepticism, while avoiding his example of arrogance and certainty. Medicine has come an astonishingly long way from Galen's time. We've cured diseases, extended lives, and reduced suffering on a scale he couldn't have imagined. But we got here by eventually having the courage to say that Galen, brilliant as he was wrong. That's the real lesson. No authority is infallible, no theory is beyond question, no knowledge is final. The moment we forget that, we stop advancing. Galen devoted his life to understanding the human body and healing the sick. He succeeded and failed in equal measure. He saved lives and probably ended some too with his treatments. He preserved knowledge and propagated errors. He was a product of his time who influenced times far beyond his own. He was, in short, a fascinating, complicated figure who deserves to be remembered not as a saint or a charlatan, but as a flawed genius who tried to make sense of the world with the tools he had. And in case you've enjoyed our evening talk so much and still might be awake, here is another educational video for you.